Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. I know there are tons of mailbox stories out there, but I just heard this one from my mom about my Aunt Sarah, a close family friend who passed away last year, and I thought you guys would get a kick out of it. About 10 years ago, when Aunt Sarah and Mom were in college, their engineering professor came to class with a problem that needed solving. His mailbox was getting smashed by someone driving by every night. He and his wife had put up like 5 or 6 mailboxes, and each time it got knocked over by someone in a blue pickup truck. The professor offered extra credit to any group of students who could design a truck-proof mailbox that met city regulations and stayed within a $100 budget, which was still a decent chunk of change back then. Mom says if you know anything about engineers, they love solving problems, and if it's engineering students, they'll make it a wild ride. Mom and Aunt Sarah teamed up and got to work. They found a steel pipe that fit mailbox regulations. Posts have to be a certain height, width, and depth, and filled it with a mix of concrete and steel rebar. After the concrete set, they welded 10 rebars to the sides of the pipe, bent them in half, and stuck the whole thing in a big plastic planter. "What if we fill it with something super heavy?" Aunt Sarah suggested. "Good idea," Mom replied. "Let's use those broken chunks of concrete from the demolition site next door." They loaded that planter up with the heaviest debris they could find. For the finishing touch, they spray painted it to look like wood and mounted the ugliest clearance sale mailbox we could find on top, welding it down for good measure. They hauled this beast into class, more like dragged it because it weighed a ton, and told the professor to bury the planter where the mailbox usually stood. Since they were the first to turn in their project, the professor agreed to give it a shot. That night, the professor and his wife were jolted awake by a loud clang, followed by a string of curses. They rushed outside to find that blue pickup speeding away, with the mailbox still standing proud. At the base lay a mangled metal baseball bat. A few days later, the professor got a hospital bill in the mail. Turns out when the passenger swung at the mailbox, he seriously messed up his arm and shoulder. They were thinking about suing the professor, but he lawyered up quick. The professor's attorney called them and said, "So you're admitting to repeatedly vandalizing the mailbox?" That shut them up real fast. As far as Mom knows, that mailbox is still standing strong today. The other students who brought in their designs had theirs given to different professors around town, and those are apparently still going strong too. Mom chuckled as she finished the story. "You know, Sarah and I never thought our college shenanigans would turn into family legends. But here we are, still talking about that darn mailbox a decade later." The next one is an entitled people story. I've lived on my family's farm for most of my life. It's been in our family for generations, passed down from my great-grandparents. The land means everything to us. It's not just our livelihood, but our home and our legacy. We've always had good relationships with our neighbors, trading produce and lending a hand when needed. That is, until the Johnsons moved in next door about 2 years ago. From day one, the Johnsons were trouble. They complained about every little thing. The smell of manure, the sound of our tractor early in the morning, even the roosters crowing. I tried to be patient and explain that this is just part of farm life, but they wouldn't hear it. Things came to a head last month when I discovered they had built a shed on our property without even asking. I was out checking the fences one afternoon when I spotted it. A brand new wooden shed sitting right inside our property line. At first I thought I must be mistaken about where the boundary was, but nope. This shed was a good 20 feet onto our land. I was furious. Who did they think they were, just building on someone else's property like that? I marched right over to their house and knocked on the door. Mrs. Johnson answered, looking annoyed that I'd interrupted her day. "Can I help you?" she said in that snooty voice of hers. "Yeah, you can explain why there's a shed on my property," I said, trying to keep my cool. She had the nerve to look confused. "What are you talking about? That shed is on our land." "No, it's not. It's a good 20 feet past the property line you built on my farm without permission." Her husband came to the door then. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, puffing out his chest like he was trying to intimidate me. I explained the situation again. Mr. Johnson scoffed. "That land's been sitting empty for years. We're just making use of it. Besides, adverse possession laws mean it's ours now anyway." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's my farmland. Just because I'm not actively planting crops there doesn't mean you can steal it. You need to move that shed immediately." They refused, insisting the land was theirs now. I told them they had 48 hours to remove the shed or I'd do it myself. They slammed the door in my face. I called my lawyer right away to see what my options were. He confirmed that the Johnsons had absolutely no right to build on my property, and that adverse possession takes much longer than 2 years to kick in. He advised me to document everything and said I was within my rights to remove the structure myself if they refused. I gave them the full 48 hours, hoping they'd come to their senses. But the shed was still there when I checked, so I fired up the tractor, hooked up some heavy chains, and started tearing that sucker down. It only took about 20 minutes to reduce it to a pile of boards and roofing. I was just finishing up when I heard sirens. The Johnsons had called the cops on me. 2 patrol cars pulled up and officers got out, looking confused by the scene. "What's going on here?" one asked. Before I could answer, Mrs. Johnson came running over, fake tears in her eyes. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man is destroying our property." I calmly explained the situation, how they had built the shed on my land without permission, how I'd given them notice to remove it, and how I was simply exercising my right to remove an illegal structure from my property. I showed them the property line markers and offered to get my deed from the house. The officers listened to both sides and then pulled me aside. "Look," one said, "I believe you about the property line, but this could get messy. Are you sure you want to go this route?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. "I've already talked to my lawyer. They had no right to build here and I gave them fair warning." The cop nodded. "All right then, we'll file a report, but this is ultimately a civil matter. You folks will have to work it out yourselves or take it to court." The Johnsons were livid when they realized the police weren't going to arrest me or make me rebuild their shed. They started yelling about suing me for destruction of property. I just shrugged and told them to talk to my lawyer. Sure enough, a few days later I got served with lawsuit papers. The Johnsons were suing me for $50,000 for destroying their shed and emotional distress. I would have laughed if it wasn't so ridiculous. My lawyer was confident we'd win easily. We had all the documentation proving the shed was on my land, plus witnesses who could testify that I'd given the Johnsons notice to remove it. We filed a countersuit for trespassing and the cost of removing the debris. The case dragged on for a few months. The Johnsons tried every trick in the book, claiming adverse possession, arguing that the property line was wrong, even saying they'd had verbal permission from my late father years ago. But in the end, the judge saw right through their lies. Not only did the judge dismiss their lawsuit, but he ruled in our favor on the countersuit. The Johnsons had to pay for the cleanup costs plus my legal fees. The look on their faces when the verdict was read was priceless. You'd think that would be the end of it, but the Johnsons just couldn't let it go. They started a smear campaign in the neighborhood telling anyone who would listen that I was a bully who destroyed their property. Most folks knew better than to believe them, but it was still frustrating to deal with. Things finally quieted down when the Johnsons put their house on the market a few months later. I guess they realized they weren't cut out for country living after all. The new neighbors who moved in are much nicer. They actually came over to introduce themselves and ask about the property lines to make sure they didn't overstep. Looking back, I probably could have handled the situation more diplomatically, but when someone tries to steal your land that's been in your family for generations, it's hard not to get your back up. I don't regret standing my ground. This farm is my heritage and my future, and I'll always fight to protect it. The whole ordeal was a headache, but it taught me some valuable lessons about dealing with difficult neighbors and the importance of knowing your property rights. I'm just glad it's over and I can get back to focusing on what really matters, tending this land and keeping my family's farming legacy alive. The next one is a petty revenge story. We've all experienced the embarrassing parent. Many have had one, some have experienced it firsthand. The public display of affection was the worst for me. My mom used to take great pride in telling me she loved me in front of my friends. She'd tell them stories that were funny, but as a teen made you want the earth to open up and swallow you whole. Fast forward to me being 38. I get along well with my mom. She's unironically my best friend. Every conversation ends with mutual "I love you." I am working in a supermarket, moving stuff around in a section. Mom has been away for a week and she happens to stop in at the place I'm working. She spots my car, decides she wants to say hello, and comes and finds me. I'm up on a step, face first in the shelves. She approaches and gives a quiet, "Excuse me." I'm always getting asked for help, so I put on my customer service face, step down, and turn around. I give her a hug and a kiss, we have a short chat, and I go back to work. When she reaches the end of the aisle, I'm on the step, head above the shelves. I yell out, "Hey!" Mom stops and turns. "I love you." Sing-song. So loud. People 2 aisles over heard it. Mom went red in the face, looks at the ground and mutters, just loudly enough for me to hear, "I love you too." I still laugh at it. The next one is a malicious compliance story. The city I live in has extremely inflated vehicle values compared to the surrounding areas. If you buy the same car from a neighboring state, you can often save $3,000 to $4,000 without really trying. When I buy a new vehicle, which happens every 3-4 years, I always look in the surrounding states to compare pricing. This story happened about 5 years ago, and the malicious compliance is still ongoing to this day. I was shopping for a new car, brand new, and found one that matched my specs about 12 hours away in a neighboring state. It was priced about $5,000 below comps. After looking up flights, there was a one-way direct flight that took me to their local airport for around $175. Plus the gas to drive back. I was looking at a total of maybe $275 to save $5,000. Absolutely worth it in this situation. I reached out to the dealership, negotiated a bit, and agreed on a price. I let them know that I would be flying in to pick up the car, and offered to pay in full in advance of the flight. They told me that all they needed was a $1,000 deposit, and that the car was considered mine. We signed a contract, and I paid the deposit, and then I booked the flight for 3 days from then. First sign of things gone awry. When I showed up at the airport, the dealership was supposed to pick me up. This had been arranged in advance. A quick phone call later, and I grabbed an Uber to take me the 20 miles to the dealership with the promise of them covering that cost. No big deal either way. Second sign of things gone awry. When I showed up at the dealership, the salesman I had been speaking with asked me if I wanted to walk the lot with him to look at a few cars. Yes, cars, plural. Questioning what he meant by that. We walked into the lot to see these cars that he was talking about. Were these some special type of gold inlaid, full self-driving, full self-flying Amaze Mobiles? No, they were not. When I point blank asked to see the car that I was buying, the one with VIN XYZ listed in this signed contract with a deposit on it, I was told it was no longer available. The salesman offered to show me similar cars, which would have been fine were we able to come to similar terms on pricing, but all of these cars outrageously priced, think $2,000 over MSRP, instead of $5,000 under MSRP. Important note for later. There was never a mention or any paperwork, signage, etc. of any incentives for giving 5-star reviews. Fast forward 2 to 3 hours. I am now convinced this dealership never had this specific car on the lot, and that this was 100% a bait and switch gone wrong. The dealership was unwilling to sell me a similar vehicle at a similar price to our negotiated one. We were over $5,000 apart. And were unwilling to pay the flight costs for this bait-and-switch scenario. A heated discussion ensued between myself and the GM, where he told me to go ahead and leave a bad review, but that I wasn't getting any free money from him. I took an Uber to a nearby hotel and booked a flight back home for the next day. Total cost? Around $750. Cue malicious compliance. This dealership had an average Google rating of right around 4.5 stars and around 400 total reviews. Pretty solid for a dealership. That night, while I was sitting in the hotel room, I had some time to burn. I spent a couple of hours creating new email accounts just so that I could leave multiple reviews for this dealership. All said and done, I had left around 21-star reviews over the course of that night, and then sort of stopped caring about the reviews. At this point, my focus shifted to recovering my lost travel expenses. A few days after getting back, I sent the dealership a demand letter for $750, which they promptly ignored. Since we had done the original contract with the deposit in both states, I was allowed to file a small claim suit in my state, which I did. The dealership never showed up to court, and I received a default judgment for $750. I did collect that, by the way. It took a few certified letters, a few phone calls, and about a year, but I did get a check for $750. As you can imagine, I was still not a happy camper. What they had done was wrong on so many levels. All of my friends knew the story of how I was bait and switched, and the fact that I flew to the dealership on a one-way ticket only made it that much worse. They had all left a bad review or two, but nothing more than a normal mad customer. Cue malicious compliance. Long term. I don't know how it started, or how it ended up lasting as long as it has. But at some point I had some time on my hands and left a bad review for this dealership. Just one, not two, not three. One. In doing so, I noticed that all of the reviews I had left right after leaving the dealership were gone. Probably taken down for being fake, or because I had left so many at the same time and the dealership reported them. I wanted to make sure this dealership wouldn't do this to someone else. So the next day, I checked to make sure that one bad review I had just left was still there. It was, and since I was thinking about it, I went ahead and created another account and left another 1-star review. Fast forward 2 to 3 years, it has now become a habit. Every time I have a few minutes to spare, I create a new account and leave a 1-star review for this dealership. Their current rating? 1.9 stars with nearly 3.5k total reviews. I am personally responsible for at least half of those reviews. When you open the dealer's website, one of the large banners that flashes across the screen advertises $50 for a 5-star review. Something about showing the review to your salesman to get a $50 Visa gift card. It has been this way since about a year after this bait and switch occurred, right around the time the 1-star reviews began to accumulate. Assuming I am responsible for half of their reviews, and the fact that the dealership only has 3.5k total reviews, they have paid $50 per review for at least 1,000 reviews, likely more than that. Meaning they have implemented a policy to pay for reviews, have spent $50,000 doing so, and have still seen their average rating drop consistently since telling me to go ahead and leave a bad review. The next one is an entitled people's story. A little background. I'm 43F with a son, 14, due to needing to leave the shared home with my ex very suddenly a couple of years ago. We have been a bit transient with our home. I have a house I own, but my best friend lives there, and apart from not wanting to make him homeless, I couldn't afford to live there on my own at the time, so we spent a yearish with my parents and then moved in with my granddad, 89, a year ago. He has dementia, diagnosed, but he doesn't agree with any of the doctors, and we lost my Nana suddenly a couple of months before we moved in. The first entitled, we moved in because my uncle, 60-something, was staying in a lounge by choice. His elderly dog couldn't go up the stairs, he said, but he made it up there pretty well when the kid, the puppy, and I moved in. Anyway, he was struggling, and I said, well, we're between homes, so we can move in. First important note is my uncle hasn't worked for quite a few years and lives in a caravan at a holiday park, on welfare. Subsidized by my grandparents, he has a drinking problem, which he doesn't admit to, and smokes like a chimney. Cigarettes are very expensive here. Obligatory, we're not in the US, so it's less common for people to live in caravans at holiday parks, and we don't tend to have the really big caravans, mobile homes. My uncle is the youngest of 3, and Granddad talks a lot about how he needs to fix the problem and that he was spoilt, etc. Well, before we moved in, he sent me an email about taking over from him, which gave me a lovely panic attack, as I work and study and have a child and was going in to help not be a full-time caregiver. And there are many, many, many entitled things he's done since I've been there. The short list is buying his wine and cigarettes with Granddad's money, borrowed the car, doesn't do much of anything besides some washing, asks for me to do his stuff, like take Granddad to the DR, left the space he'd been staying in a tip, borrowed money for a fancy laptop. Actually, he borrows money constantly. He's quite creative in getting to use Granddad's money. Actually, my mom had to step in and take over the finances. So I stuck to boundaries, and he settled down with asking unreasonable things of me, but he's still lazy and entitled and far too busy to do more than the 3 lunchtimes a week he does for Granddad. The second and third entitled, Mum is the middle of 3, and her older brother is just as entitled, if not more, not to mention his wife. Actually, she's the main antagonist at the moment. Which brings us to the dishes. The eldest uncle and his wives have been helpful, but not necessarily for the right reasons. Mostly just to prove they're better than his younger brother. So lots of nasty things said and trying to get people on their side, etc. Which for the most part I ignore, or Mum and I vent about it. Among all of this, I have messages and emails I'm not only always copied into, but the one-on-one messages I get from both sides worries me. So since I'm the granddaughter and have no legal responsibility like Mum does, I pass on things to her, to protect myself more than anything. The dishes. Since my eldest uncle and his wife have been helping more, they've decided that they're in charge, and I've been spoken down to more than once by my uncle over the years, but now his wife, who acts like my best friend, who I don't trust as far as I could throw her, she lies a lot, and was quite horrible to my cousins as they were growing up. She decided I needed telling off, like a child, actually no, like a piece of trash, ironically. My beloved 98-year-old grandma had been unwell and going downhill since the end of last year, and even though it was expected, her death a few weeks ago devastated me. We spent at least a day a week together, and I helped her as much as she'd let me, and her passing hit me hard, and I've also been in therapy for unrelated issues, so I wasn't doing well. And neither was my son. His great-grandma adored him, and he loves her just as much. The dishwasher broke at Christmas, so we've been doing the dishes by hand, which is my son's job. Last week, the day before Grandma's funeral, he hadn't done them. Not many. But it was our night off and he would be with his dad. So I saw no point hassling him as we are both grieving, and I was going to go back and do them later on. She got to the house and decided I had done it on purpose and sent me several pics of the bench and the few stacked and rinsed dishes with a rude message. Like I couldn't imagine talking to anyone like that. I cried, Mum handled, she's the best, and got shouted at by her brother because he and his wife were in mourning too as their cat had died. They compared the loss of their cat. Yes, sad, I know losing a pet is not nice, but comparing it for a start was ridiculous and is no excuse for the way she talked to me. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.